Rozmarin. She teaches at the Gender Studies program at Bar-Ilan University. The second book just came out, and its title is Vulnerable Futures, Transformative Pasts on Vulnerability, Temporality, and Ethics. Dr. Rozmarin will speak about responsibility and vulnerability.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank Professor Walden for his wonderful talk. I think his argument about the intrinsic connection between rights as an abstract construction, or as a list, as he said, and our moral subjectivity and the important aspects of moral subjectivity, like responsibility, is what I want to concentrate on today. And I want to focus on moral subjectivity and more profoundly on the connection between responsibility, agency, our ability to act, and vulnerability. If we listen to these two previous talks, the language of liberal theory and more modern moral philosophy concentrate on choice, on freedom, interests. That's better. Okay. But my presupposition is that vulnerability is one of the most pronounced affects facing our present and future. Many today share the sense of being exposed to unpredicted worldwide dynamics governed by a sense of insecurity. Rapid and dramatic political dynamics, hypercapitalism losing its legitimacy and fighting to keep its dominance, ecological processes which dictate massive global changes, and a fragmented sense of temporality and belonging, all make people more aware of the vast influence that social factors have on their lives and put in question the individualistic ethos of modernism. In this reality, vulnerability can no longer be taken as an affect prominent only in specific groups or crisis situations. Instead, vulnerability becomes a long-term relations between people and their lives and with their surroundings. This reality challenges us to rethink our sense of moral subjectivity and the basic moral concepts this notion entails. More specifically, it challenges us to take into account vulnerability as part of who we are as moral subjects. As part of this theoretical challenge, my aim in this paper is to explore the relations between responsibility and vulnerability as these influence the notion of agency. I would like to argue for 2 points. First, responsibility for others' vulnerability does not necessarily mean taking measures to restore some sense of resilience and independence. Second, the discussion of extended responsibility for the vulnerability of groups and individuals should not reduce vulnerability to passivity. Instead, the theoretical challenge facing vulnerabilities is to locate the options of agency in situations of vulnerability. In liberal-oriented accounts of vulnerability ethics, vulnerability has moral significance as it is a symptom of need or distress that calls for society response. Moreover, since vulnerability is understood as presupposing dependency, it is understood as attesting to damage or lack of autonomy and agency. As a result of this association between autonomy and independence versus vulnerability and dependence, in liberal-oriented accounts, vulnerability evokes the responsibility of the less vulnerable or the not vulnerable. As for those who are identified as vulnerable, the vulnerability is considered to be a sign of reduced personal responsibility for transforming the social conditions that produce intensive vulnerability. Robert Goodin's Protecting the Vulnerable dated 1985, presented a pioneering account of vulnerability as basis of ethics. Gooding invokes the intuition that we all have special moral obligation to our families and close friends. He argued that the dependency of family members constitutes their vulnerability to the other's actions. Because we are especially positioned to help or hurt these individuals, we are responsible for their well-being. Gooding extends this model to encompass our relations with strangers and to society's responsibility to its members. Vulnerability here directly stems from the dependency of others upon the ethical subject. Gooding deduces a concept of collective responsibility which serves as a basis for an account of social justice within a political community. He advocates the idea that the group is responsible for actively protecting the interests of the vulnerable. Gooding stresses that vulnerability is not reciprocal, and so is the responsibility to care and aid. But, as was later argued by Yves Kitai, the distribution of vulnerability is not similar to the map of power and dependency over others. For example, although children have less social accepted options to manage their parents' life, and they are less capable of independence, parents are imminently vulnerable to in their parenthood. Their well-being and social position as good parents are at least partially in the hands of their kids. Gooding's account, like other liberal-oriented views of vulnerability, sustains a split between vulnerability as a fact about others, which yield responsibility, and vulnerability as a shared human condition. Although we are vulnerable because we are dependent on others, this dependency is relevant only in limited ways to our moral agency. In no way does our vulnerability inform our moral considerations or functions as a moral disposition or moral desire to respond in a certain way. This split appears because, although Gooding regards vulnerability as a human condition, he nonetheless assumes that autonomy as independence is a necessary condition for moral agency. In this respect, Gooding's important work exemplifies the duality of liberal-oriented discussions on vulnerability. While vulnerability is used to question the liberal modern image of the subject, vulnerability in this framework is considered as a negative of autonomy and thus associated with risk and weakness and damage agency. Martin Nussbaum is another example of this liberal dual relation to vulnerability. Martin Nussbaum's works is another example of this liberal-oriented treatment of vulnerability as a basis for ethical and social responsibility. Nussbaum's work on social justice and responsibility also implies that the vulnerable have minimal or damaged agency in creating capabilities. Her work in her book from 2011, Nussbaum argues that people's existence and flourishing depend on their relation with others and on the social conditions that shape their everyday realities. People's realization of their capabilities is the main good that society should defend in order to be a just and moral society. Nussbaum assumes that by realizing our capabilities, we become more independent and autonomous. Although we are inherently social beings, this sociality as codependence become a consistent factor only if we fail to achieve autonomy and independence. For Nussbaum, we are essentially vulnerable to social conditions and interpersonal relations that might constitute a reality which prevent individuals from fully their capabilities. Society is just to the extent that it enables its individual to fulfill their capabilities and to execute their freedom. By focusing on institutions as they manage distributive justice, Nussbaum posits vulnerable people as passive in relation to their reality and with the institution that in fact fail to care for them. These two examples shows that in liberal framework, vulnerability becomes a problem when it is manifested as dependency, challenges one's autonomy. Liberals look to restore some sense of autonomy as self-governing, which would allow one to act according to one's wishes and views. In none of the liberal accounts does people's endeavor to better their condition and lives use their vulnerability as a resource for social transformative existence. In fact, vulnerability is contradicted to the basic conditions for person's agency, and thus associated with the lessening of personhood. But can we rethink responsibility facing vulnerability without assuming that it is a symptom of reduced and damaged autonomy and agency? Stressing the relationality, corporality, and sociality of the human subject should lead us to think about agency beyond the subject's will and autonomy. It should challenge us to understand how vulnerability can lead people to new kinds of sensitivity and modes of being in the world with others that would help them navigate in the complex net of vulnerabilities. The theoretical challenge is to theorize how people are creating ad hoc options, challenging norms, and engaging with and through their vulnerability. The assumption that people actively engage with their reality, even in situations of enhanced vulnerability, should not mean that society should be less responsible for vulnerable population or individuals. Instead, it calls for reconceptualization of responsibility. I would like to elaborate on one such option by briefly discuss the work of Judith Butler. In her book, Precarious Life, Butler posits vulnerability as a condition imminent to life. We are vulnerable bodies fundamentally exposed to the touch of others in need of protection and care. These vulnerabilities follows from our being socially constituted bodies, attached to others, at risk of losing those attachments, exposed to others, at risk of violence by virtue of that exposure. In a culture that regards autonomy and resilience as conditions for well-being, vulnerability is denied in order to hold some phantasm of omnipotence, independence, and revenge. Butler discerns between precariousness as ontological vulnerability, which is this openness that serves as precondition for subjectivity, and precarity, which stems from specific conditions rendering some humans more at risk of exploitation, injustice, and violence. Butler asserts that our precarity is to a large extent dependent upon the organization of economic and social relationships, the presence or absence of sustaining infrastructures and social and political institutions. Ontological vulnerability or precariousness is a necessary condition of the experience of being human. And it denotes the dual ontological openness towards the care as well as the possible act of violence. The ontological vulnerability is not a separate and abstract aspect of humanity. Life, according to Butler, is livable only if sustained by normative practices that set actual conditions for existence. The ontological dependency on others for care happens in a space that is social and shaped by normative practices. Thus, these norms have constitutive power to determine who would count as a subject and whose life would have any value. Vulnerability appeals for recognition. It is not a recognition of what one is or the validity of one's claims or point of view, but an ethical gesture through which we acknowledge the other's subjectivity and humanity beyond shared language, community, or values. Denying recognition for one's vulnerability means depriving her or his body of their ability to express humanity. Thus, we could say that any social reality that is constituted by two dimensions of violence or harm that differ in their relation to the norm. Norms consist of practices of legislation, legitimation, representation, policing, surveillance, and so forth, which sustains a social reality in which vulnerability is heightened or diminished along intersectional lines. Some groups will find the care or protection they need to flourish, and others will be disproportionately exposed to risk, physical, emotional, or other. The fifth sort of violence is the concrete acts that occur between already established subjects, individual or collective. The kind of violence enabled by norms that secure the privilege of some forms of personhood by posing others as less than human. The second sort of violence stems from the nature of norms which both enable and constrain what can be regarded as full humanity, and thus ban certain desires, experience, and actions to be sustainable aspects of people's life. Here, violence is first and foremost associated with the reduction of certain people's lives to a mere physical existence. The harm caused by this violence is prior to the constitution of the subject. Part of its effects is the eradication of a future-oriented temporality that sustains subjectivity as freedom. This violence is also enabled by the shaping of realness of violence itself. Normative practices establish the meaning or lack of meaning of suffering and harm on the one hand, and of certain acts and their effects on the other. It is important to clarify that what is erased by this violence is not merely abstract options or possible words that are merely logical options of life not lived. Instead, Butler points to actual lives, actual bodies who are not protected and cannot flourish because norms leave them outside the recognizable boundaries of humanity. Thus, although this violence is painfully concrete and marked on actual bodies, it is left beyond what we recognize as violence. Outside the violence we see and hear, beyond the tools we have to protect the vulnerable and restrain the abusers. How can we, as a community, as society and individuals, be responsible for vulnerability that is intensified and shaped by the normative boundaries that constitute our social meaningfulness? For Butler, responsibility cannot be rational obligation. Following Levinas, responsibility hunts us. It stems from our corporal experience of sharing space with others. If we allow ourselves to view our lives from the perspective of our shared vulnerability, the responsibility for the other's life is not a choice. It is more like a calling, a command, Levinas would say, that one can reflect on but cannot escape. Taking responsibility through shared vulnerability means creating a normative discourse which promotes continual effort to challenge the tendency towards certainty and a sense of autonomy. It calls us to reimagine ways of politics that trouble existing boundaries by showing solidarity with those who are unintelligible. This necessarily interferes with the attempts of groups to create a coherent self-narrative that would justify their lives and actions. This responsibility calls for humility as a political virtue of collective and individual. Instead of on the basis of fantasy of self-mastery, we can extend this humility to others in a form of generosity. We can begin to see how the failure of the independent subject become the condition, not the obstacle of ethics. Beyond the responsibility to act in order to support the life and dignity of those whose vulnerability is already known, there is a responsibility to stay open to reformulations, constant renegotiations of the categories with which we understand the world. In this way, it is our vulnerability that can inform us that it is time to listen to others beyond the tendency to justify our point of view. It is our vulnerability that inform our actions in drawing the necessary but fragile line between appreciating one's life and endangering the others. Thank you.